Psalm 22, verse 16. For dogs have surrounded me. The assembly of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. They had their orders. Jesus of Nazareth was to be crucified along with a couple of thieves already on death row. Well, the soldiers slipped easily into the routine. They prepared the placards to be paraded before each prisoner announcing his crime. The uprights for the crosses were already at the place of the skull. From a storeroom, they fetched ropes and the timbers that would be used as the horizontal members of the crosses. They placed the heavy crossbars across the prisoners' shoulders and tied their wrists to them. They finished their preparations casually. It was just another day's work. True, one of the prisoners was unusual. Jesus of Nazareth was a preacher from Galilee. He had been brought to Pilate just that morning by the Jewish leaders. They said he claimed to be king. Hardly a believable charge. He had no army and none of the trappings of royalty. Still, the prisoner and his indictment had provided some great entertainment for the soldiers. Earlier in the day, while they had been waiting for Pilate and the priest to finish their haggling, one of them had found a faded purple robe that hinted of past splendor. They draped it around Jesus, braided a crown of thorn branches, jammed it on his head, and shoved a stick into his hands as a scepter. Then they paid mock obeisance. Ha! A Jewish king? That would be the day. And they rose from their knees to spit in his face. Snatching the stick from his hand, they'd hit him over the head. It had been hilarious. But you had to admit, this man was infuriatingly calm. I mean, he was hurting. They made sure of that. But he refused to show anger or beg for mercy. He seemed to ignore them. He made fools of them, but they'd show him. Everyone broke on the cross. He'd be begging for mercy or cursing the pain soon enough. As the soldiers marched the three convicts away from the prison, their customary pace was slowed by the press of Jewish Passover pilgrims in the streets. Then, just before they reached the gate on the way out, the preacher collapsed. They hollered at him, prodded him, but it was hopeless. He was gone. Now what? The men looked to Longinus, their commanding officer. "Untie him," he ordered. He whispered to another soldier who stepped into the edge of the crowd. As this soldier shoved a man to the center, the soldiers breathed a sigh of relief. From his looks and clothes, he had to be a foreigner. Someone who'd do what he was told instead of some local hothead who would start a riot. With a new cross-bearer, the soldiers again moved the procession toward Golgotha, accompanied by a heckling mob. The soldiers paid them no mind as long as they did not interfere with the day's work. On Golgotha, the place of the skull, some called it Golgotha, the soldiers continued their well-rehearsed routine. They stripped the accused, fixed them to the boards, and erected the crosses. On the upright above each convict's head, they nailed the placard announcing his crime. The soldiers took special pleasure in posting the preacher's placard, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." It was written in 3 languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. The soldiers joked to each other under their breath, "Take that, you Jews. See what happens when you challenge Rome." Now, one of the perks of doing an execution was the privilege of claiming the convict's clothes. Not that the clothes of brigands usually amounted to much. Still, in that society, any piece of fabric was worth something. As the soldiers divided up the clothes, ripping them to make the portions even, one of them held up Jesus' robe and protested, "Hey, look, you guys, this is too good to just rip up. I mean, it's woven in one piece. It doesn't have a single seam. What do you say? Let's roll some dice and toss for it." Somebody pulled dice from his pocket. "Call it." And they put in their bids. As they tossed the dice, they all leaned over to see who'd won. Their congratulations for the winner were mixed with good-natured cursing. They were finished. The only thing left to do was sit and watch, ensuring that no one rescued the convicts or put them out of their misery prematurely. So the soldiers talked, their minds miles away. Somebody remembered a wrestling match he had watched in Antioch when his troop passed through there. 2 soldiers talked about the chariot race coming up in just 6 weeks on the Ides of May in the Colosseum in Rome. One of them went on and on about the new dancing girl he had just seen at Herod's palace. Another talked of home and family. Their part in this drama had been scripted almost 1,000 years before. Their use of the nails and their petty gambling for the robe filled exactly the ancient prophecy in Psalm 22:18. "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." They were major players in the world's greatest drama. But to the soldiers, it was just another day's work. They were watching the Son of God give his life to save the world. And all they saw was a naked convict slowly suffocating, sitting a few feet from Emmanuel. They joked and gossiped, unaware of anything out of the ordinary. At noon, just as the soldiers were biting into their lunches, Golgotha was mysteriously engulfed in a bizarre and ominous darkness. It was as if a huge, invisible hand had closed the blinds. An impenetrable darkness, blackness, pressed down on the crowd. People screamed. The soldiers stopped eating, food unchewed in their mouths. Something was about to happen. The wailing of the mob filled the blackness as they tried to grope their way back toward Jerusalem, beating their breasts with hands they could not see. As the noise subsided a bit, the soldiers could hear the priests still on Golgotha hissing reproaches and warnings to each other. "Maybe he'll get away. We should have stoned him the minute we found him. I told you guys this was going to lead to no good," another voice said. "Imagine what he'll do for revenge." The mutterings of the priests about escape and revenge kind of unsettled the soldiers. I mean, the penalty for allowing a prisoner to escape was beheading. They edged a little closer to the crosses, their eyes playing tricks on them as they stared unseeing into the eerie blackness. Disturbing pictures invaded their reverie. The mocking, the purple robe, the stick scepter, the crown of thorns. Well, somehow it didn't seem so funny anymore. While they were nailing him to the cross, Jesus had neither cursed nor cowered. He did not resist them. Yet neither did he appear to be broken. His compliance with their orders was no mere resignation. He acted as though aware of some tremendous presence, as though he and they were all being watched by some august audience. He stretched his arm out for nailing, as though consciously following some celestial script rather than merely obeying an executioner's order. In the daylight, they had paid no special attention. The man was dirty, bloody, defeated. Now in the blackness, with nothing but fear for distraction, the soldiers fought off the sensation that the preacher was watching them. Against their will, they recalled the preacher's outburst, "Father, forgive them. They don't understand what they are doing." They'd never heard words like these from a convict before. Who was this man anyway? Was he just another crazy holy man? I mean, there were plenty of those around. And this business of, "Father, forgive them." What did they need forgiveness for anyway? They were just doing their job. Was it any fault of theirs that this fellow could not pull off his scheme to become king? Who did this man think he was, praying to God for their forgiveness? That is what they had thought when he said the words. Now, with every nerve straining against the unnatural darkness, a retort echoed through their heads. Who did Pilate think he was, sentencing when he sent this man to the cross? It was impossible to shake the sense that this darkness was all because of this king. None of the soldiers nor anyone else on Golgotha gave a thought to the thieves in the darkness. Just why or how the king and the darkness were connected, they didn't know. But the soldiers trembled with an instinctive dread that nature itself was somehow on the side of Jesus of Nazareth. Maybe his forgiveness was worth something after all. "Have you heard the stories about the robe?" Longinus asked in a whisper. "Up north in Galilee, Jesus was walking in some big crowd when he suddenly stopped and asked who had touched him. The people laughed. 'What do you mean, who touched you? 100 people must have touched you in the last 5 minutes.' But this Jesus wouldn't move. 'Somebody touched me,' he insisted. 'I felt power leave me.' People were getting fidgety, wondering if he had gone mad or something. I mean, there must have been 1,000 people in the street. Well, finally, some woman spoke up. 'I touched you, sir.' Seems she had some female problem that made her bleed. Had it for 12 years. And you know how these Jewish people are about that kind of thing. It's a ritual impurity. She had been an untouchable all that time. Spent all of her money on doctors. Nothing helped. She told the story right there in front of all those people. She had just touched the man's robe, she said. Now she knew she was well. When Longinus finished his story, the men fell silent, brooding. They'd all heard stories about Jesus healing blind people and epileptics and lepers. They'd even heard that he could raise the dead. This man was different, had been different all day from any other convict they'd ever handled. Nature seemed to be on his side. Who was he, really? For 3 eternal hours, the soldiers stayed at their post, fighting the terror of the unnatural gloom and their fear that something might happen they'd have to answer for. At last, the darkness began lifting. The terror subsided. Taut muscles began to relax. Again, the soldiers were simply standing guard over 3 dying criminals. But the blackness had permanently altered their commanding officer, Longinus. It had opened his mind to Jesus of Nazareth. The centurion stared at the king, bewildered, perplexed, entranced. Like everyone else, he had heard stories about this man. But this afternoon, in the darkness, with nature itself testifying to Jesus' uniqueness, Longinus saw something new. Now, in the returning light, Longinus watched Jesus with a fierce intensity. When Jesus called out that he was thirsty, Longinus directed a soldier to give him a drink using a sponge on a stick. It was crude and pitifully scant help, but it was the best the centurion could do, given his duty. Not long afterward, Jesus shouted, "It is finished," and then dropped his head. There was a strong earthquake, as though the whole earth was reverberating in answer to Jesus' cry. The earthquake sealed the growing conviction in Longinus' heart. "Surely," he exclaimed, "this man was the Son of God." The words were spontaneous. They came straight from the core of his being. Jesus had won another man to his kingdom. Tradition tells us that this declaration at the cross marked the beginning of a lifelong allegiance to Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. There's a sobering message for us in the story of the soldiers. They witnessed the real dignity of Jesus in his response to the weeping women along the streets of Jerusalem. They handled Jesus when he stretched out his arms to the nails, as though embracing his mysterious and grand destiny. Jesus spoke forgiveness for them while they were within earshot. They were present when Jesus comforted his mother and offered paradise to the thief. They were still at Golgotha when nature itself bore testimony to the uniqueness of the man on the middle cross. But they were oblivious to the cosmic dimensions of the drama in which they were acting a part. The same kind of thing happens today. People can live with a Christian spouse. They can take Bible as literature courses in college. They can enjoy the splendor and majesty of Yosemite or the Grand Canyon and still be utterly blind to the presence and power of God. But this failure to recognize God's proximity is not limited to people who call themselves agnostics. We can be baptized, official members of a church, calling ourselves by a denominational name, and still receive nothing from Christ. We can even receive communion and still receive nothing more than it did the soldier who won the toss of the dice for Jesus' robe. We can surround ourselves with the mysteries of God in a forest, or the grandeur of God in the mountains, white oaks, sugar maples, redwoods, bald cypress trees, all fairly shout the majesty and wisdom of God. But many cannot see the Creator for the trees. Jesus offers us himself in baptism, church life, and communion. He expresses himself in nature. In a sense, he invites us to touch the hem of his robe by participating in these symbolic expressions of our faith. He invites us to touch and be healed. Jesus offers us himself in the mystery and wonder of nature. And there too, the discerning can find the hem of his robe, touch, and be healed. It is so easy to come to worship as a spectator. We expect the choir to perform well. We may critique the organist's performance. Too much volume, too slow, too loud, too highbrow. We hope the preacher will deliver an engaging, thought-provoking sermon. When we leave, we may analyze the elements of the service, the music, the preaching, the social atmosphere, and be really unaware of having been in the presence of God. Like the people thronging Jesus in Galilee, or the soldiers sitting there around at the cross. We're mere spectators. Sacred symbols can mediate God only to those with open hearts. We need to cultivate attentiveness to God so that when he reveals himself through his word, through baptism, communion, or nature, we will receive his revelation. The soldiers passed several hours, first talking and laughing, then cowering, within a few feet of the greatest of all kings, the wisest of all preachers. They heard his words, they watched him, they heard nothing, saw nothing of the transcendent. Nature futilely testified to his majesty. The soldiers played dice, gambling at the crux of history, oblivious to their opportunity. We too can miss God, not because he is distant, because we are too preoccupied to notice him. But there is good news. Even for someone who has been long in a religious environment, but who has not really encountered Jesus, there is hope. The centurion, one of the men who all afternoon failed to recognize what he was doing and who he was killing, when he saw what had happened, glorified God, saying, "Certainly this was a righteous man. Truly, this man was the Son of God." Luke 23 and Mark 15. If you have gone to church, even to communion, and have not seen God, there is still hope. If you are stubborn in coming into the presence of God when and where he is lifted up as the crucified Savior, you may yet join with the centurion in seeing. It took the centurion all day to see, and he was in the immediate, literal presence of Jesus. It may seem to be taking you much too long, but Jesus' graciousness to others, his words, and the testimony of nature will finally breach the barriers in your mind and emotions. Spend the time in his presence. And you will be able to say with glad confidence, truly, truly, this man is the Son of God.